Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're returning to the Dutch Golden Age, a century of balance, thrift, and quiet pride. It was an age that mapped the seas, built empires on reason, and measured beauty with the precision of an accountant's hand. Yet despite all that order, the people found themselves undone, not by war or plague, but by a flower, a delicate bloom from the east that promised refinement and brought ruin. This is the bizarre history of Tulip Mania, the first financial bubble. Before we drift into that world, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. In the early decades of the 17th century, Holland looks like the promise of civilization fulfilled. The canals ran straight, their mirrored surfaces broken only by the slow passage of barges, heavy with spice, sugar, and the quiet satisfaction of trade. Merchant houses stood shoulder to shoulder in tidy ranks, their windows shining with both cleanliness and pride. Within those walls, ledgers were kept with near religious devotion, every coin accounted for, every risk weighed. Here, reason had become a national art. Even beauty seemed to obey geometry. Paintings captured rooms so balanced and precise that disorder appeared almost indecent. It was an age that prized calm over passion, profit over impulse, and proportion above all. And yet, in that world of measured virtue, something unexpected took root. A bloom too vivid, too unruly, to belong to such order. The tulip arrived quietly, carried from the Ottoman Empire through the hands of diplomats and scholars. It was the sort of import that carried both mystery and prestige, a traveller from a more ornamental world. The Ottomans had long cultivated the tulip as a symbol of divine perfection, its cup-shaped petals echoing the turban, its symmetry admired as a reflection of paradise itself. In the sober Netherlands, it seemed almost indecently beautiful. Its colours, scarlet, flame, and gold, glowed like tiny fires against the country's palette of pewter skies and brick facades. Even its leaves had a peculiar dignity, curving like script in a foreign tongue. For a people who had mastered the art of control, the tulip's elegance was a revelation. Beauty, distilled and defiant, that could not be built, bargained, or reasoned with. At first it belonged to scholars. In the 1590s, the botanist Carolus Clusius planted a small collection of bulbs in the new Hortus Botanicus at Leiden University, where they astonished visitors by thriving in the damp Dutch soil. From there, curiosity spread. Botanists in Leiden and Haarlem studied the flower with the earnestness reserved for new continents. They dissected bulbs, noted their varieties, traced their uncertain origins. Gardeners laid out beds with scientific precision, counting petals and mapping colour as if cataloguing a star. The tulip thrived in this atmosphere of quiet wonder, admired for its novelty and for what it represented, a union of art and nature, refinement and knowledge. In a nation that had turned commerce into an expression of intellect, the tulip seemed a harmless indulgence, a luxury of the mind. But beauty never stays harmless for long. Across the narrow streets of Dutch towns, rumours of the new flower began to circulate, not among traders yet, but among the polite circles of the educated and the wealthy. To possess a tulip was to show discernment, a sign that one's eye had been trained by the same precision that governed trade and theology. Collectors traded bulbs, the way humanists exchanged books. each variety discussed with the same learned enthusiasm as a painting or a treatise. The flower's rarity lent it dignity. Its fleeting bloom gave it poignancy. To see it was to witness perfection that refused to last. And so, as with all rare things, admiration began to mingle with desire. In the merchant gardens of Haarlem and Amsterdam, tulips appeared like small miracles amid the rigour of clipped hedges and boxwood borders. Visitors leaned in close, squinting at the delicate flames that licked across the petals. Those mysterious streaks of white and crimson that no one yet understood were born of a virus. Each bloom was slightly different, a natural fingerprint of colour and chance. They were given Latin names, moral reflections, even religious interpretations. Some saw in them the fleetingness of life, others the caprice of God. But beneath the moralizing tone lay something more human, a longing to possess what could not truly be owned. Painters too began to take notice. In still lifes heavy with oysters, lemons and silverware, a single tulip often rose above the composition like a small act of rebellion. Its petals caught the light in a way no metal could. Even rendered in paint it seemed alive, almost insolent, beside the obedient perfection of domestic objects. In these images, the Dutch fascination with order met its opposite, beauty that thrived precisely because it could not be measured. For all their restraint, the Dutch understood spectacle, and the tulip was a spectacle small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Still, for a time, the fascination remained genteel. A scholar might exchange a bulb for a rare book, or a painter might receive one as a gift from a patron. They were tokens of intellect, not currency. There were no markets yet, no tavern chatter, no frenzy. The flower was admired as one admires a comet, a phenomenon to be discussed, not pursued. Those who cultivated tulips did so as a hobby of refinement, their gardens neat, their expectations modest. In a world shaped by Calvinist restraint, beauty was safest when confined to a garden bed. But something subtle had begun to shift. Visitors to these gardens would linger a little too long, asking questions about varieties and yields. Letters circulated describing the astonishing colours of certain specimens, or the way one bloom might differ entirely from its parent. Some began to wonder whether the rarity itself, not the flower, was the true marvel. After all, what better proof of taste or prosperity than to possess what few others could? No one spoke of money yet, but everyone felt the weight of value pressing in. The Dutch were not a people easily seduced. They prided themselves on discipline, at the steady hand on the rudder, the careful stroke of the brush, the honest sum in the ledger. Yet the tulip, in its stillness, possessed a kind of motion they could not control. It grew, changed, multiplied. It was alive in ways commerce was not. And perhaps that was what drew them in. The idea that, for once, beauty might flourish on its own terms, untouched by calculation. But calculation, like water, finds its way into everything, even gardens. By the end of the 1620s, the tulip had become a quiet guest in many Dutch homes, admired, painted, debated, but still innocent of the madness it would one day inspire. In candlelit studies, collectors bent over catalogues of varieties, noting each difference with the same care they gave to ships or stocks. The air smelled of wax and earth. The bulbs slept in their boxes, unaware of the fortune and folly they would one day represent. For now, they were simply flowers, curiosities from a distant land, perfect in form, limited in number, and already, in some hidden way, beginning to stir the imagination of a nation that had learned to turn everything it loved into something it could sell. The change began so quietly that few noticed it at first. What had once been the private delight of scholars and collectors began to shimmer with something new, a touch of ambition. The tulip, already rare and beautiful, revealed a secret. It could sometimes betray its own perfection. Among the smooth, single-coloured varieties, a few emerged with strange, painterly flames streaking their petals, white breaking through crimson, gold through purple, violet through black. They looked like small miracles, too intricate to be natural, too unpredictable to be replicated. These were the broken tulips, their brilliance caused by a mosaic virus no one yet understood. The infection weakened the bulb, but transformed the flower. It was, in its way, a perfect metaphor for what was to come, a beauty that grew more valuable the more fragile it became. In the gardens of Haarlem and Amsterdam, these variegated blooms began to draw attention. Collectors spoke of them in hushed admiration, as if discussing works of divine art. To own one was to possess proof that nature itself favoured you, that you had witnessed something the ordinary world was too dull to provide. Botanists debated the cause, invoking theology when science failed them. Some suggested the streaks were heavenly signatures, a divine reminder that even in order there must be wonder. Others, more pragmatic, simply saw the streaked tulip as an opportunity. The first catalogues of varieties appeared, modest at first, then increasingly ambitious, names written in Latin, carefully inked beside illustrations. A new vocabulary was born to describe them. Rosen with white on red, violetten with lilac flames, and the rarest of all, the bizarden, golden streaks that looked like fire caught in bloom. To own a bizarden was to own prestige itself. Gardens became small theatres of reputation. Behind high hedges and brick walls, merchants and scholars alike cultivated their bulbs as though preparing them for performance. Visitors were received by appointment, led through paths edged with trimmed boxwood to admire the latest marvels. There was pride in each display, but also competition. One might overhear polite envy disguised as flattery, questions that were really challenges. How long did it bloom? How many offsets will it yield? The tulip, once a curiosity, had become an index of refinement, a living measure of intellect, patience, and wealth. A man might have his portrait painted with a tulip in hand, not as gardener but as connoisseur, one who understood both the language of art and the arithmetic of rarity. In a society that distrusted vanity, the tulip offered a socially acceptable form of it. To cultivate beauty was not considered sinful if one did so with discipline. The Republic's Calvinist conscience could tolerate splendour so long as it was justified by study. Thus tulip growing became a moralised pursuit, an expression of virtue through cultivation, a domestic version of empire. Yet even as men spoke of piety and moderation, their gaze lingered too long on the petals, and their questions turned inevitably to price. Visitors compared the size of bulbs, the purity of streaks, the yield of offsets. Behind every compliment lay calculation. Beauty, it seemed, had become another form of inventory. The earliest auctions were almost ceremonial. They took place not in markets, but in the drawing rooms of learned societies or the back halls of botanical gardens. A few collectors gathered, each with his glass of wine, to exchange bulbs through the language of courtesy. Transactions were discreet, recorded in small notebooks, with the same delicacy used to record the weather. No voices were raised, no hands waved coins in the air. Prices were modest. A few florins for a good specimen, perhaps a silver goblet for a rare one. Yet already, something subtle had changed. What had once been exchanged as a gesture of friendship or taste was now mediated by value. The tulip had entered the realm of numbers. It was an age when Holland measured everything: distance, weight, even the passage of wind across the sea. Precision was a form of faith. It was only natural then that beauty too should be measured. The very language of the tulip began to shift. Instead of marvelling at colour, men spoke of weight, lineage, and yield. Catalogues listed bulbs by size and pedigree, their expected offspring recorded like heirs to a fortune. Collectors began to draw up wills specifying which tulip would pass to which child, as though flowers might carry the same dignity as silver. The scholar's garden, once a retreat of contemplation, became a ledger made visible, a place where admiration and arithmetic bloomed side by side. Even beauty, it seemed, required bookkeeping. Still, it was a polite form of obsession. Tulip owners corresponded across cities, sending letters filled with descriptions of colour and scent, accompanied by small sketches. There was pride in these exchanges, but also diplomacy. A Harlem merchant might send a bulb to a friend in Leiden as a gift, with the expectation, never stated but always understood, that it would one day be returned with something finer. The tulip became a kind of currency of civility, traded not for gold, but for acknowledgement. The more refined the flower, the greater the respect it commanded. One could almost forget that these exchanges were beginning to mirror another world entirely, the one of merchants, markets, and speculative risk. And yet the line between the gentleman collector and the merchant was never truly firm. The same men who cultivated tulips in their gardens also built fleets and financed voyages. They understood profit as a moral force, the reward for diligence and intelligence. To see a flower multiply and rise in value was not to them vanity, but vindication. The language of commerce crept slowly into the vocabulary of cultivation. Investment became a word not just for ships and spices, but for soil and bulbs. The first notaries began to record tulip contracts, small agreements between growers and collectors, ensuring that when a bulb matured, its future buyer would already be waiting. The arrangements were harmless enough, a mark of trust, a symbol of order. No one yet called it speculation. As the flower's fame spread, artists were hired to record specific varieties for catalogues and collections. These paintings, once intended as study aids for botanists, became status objects themselves, portraits of perfection that outlasted the bloom. The Semper Augustus, streaked crimson and white, appeared so often on paper that it became more real in image than in soil. People began to speak of particular flowers by name, as if they were living aristocrats. A bulb could now carry reputation across cities. It could make a man known to others who had never seen his face. To own a Semper Augustus was to possess not just a flower, but an identity. And yet, for all its delicacy, the tulip's world remained small, confined to the educated, the wealthy, and the patient. Ordinary people might have heard of the craze in passing, but for them it was as remote as art itself. The flower was still a luxury, a quiet indulgence for those who could afford to speak of beauty as though it were virtue. But a change had begun in language, the way people spoke of tulips, the way they thought of them. They were no longer simply admired, they were evaluated. A bloom might be lovely, but was it rare? Was it pure? Would it offset? Each question tilted the gaze a little further from beauty toward profit. It was only a matter of time before the merchants took notice. For decades they had watched tulips pass through the hands of scholars and collectors, admired at garden gates and sketched in notebooks, each bloom treated as a marvel of refinement. But refinement in Holland was never far from commerce. A nation that could turn wind into power and herring into empire was unlikely to leave beauty unmonetized for long. And so, sometime in the early 1630s, the flower began to drift from the garden to the counting house. What had once been a symbol of private taste now found itself measured against cargo and coin. The tulip, that polite guest of the intellectuals, was about to discover what it meant to be a commodity. The merchants approached the flower as they did everything else, systematically, with patience disguised as virtue. If a tulip could fetch such admiration, surely it could also fetch a price. The calculations were simple enough. A rare bulb could produce offspring, which meant that value could multiply. And if a flower bloomed only once a year, its scarcity could be managed, even manufactured. In the language of trade, rarity was not a mystery, but a strategy. So they began to buy, not the flowers themselves, but the potential of flowers, bulbs still in the ground, or even those not yet planted. A market of imagination took shape, one where ownership meant nothing more than a signature and the promise of spring. The first contracts were written with a kind of innocence, drawn up by notaries who understood law better than botany. A buyer agreed to purchase a bulb at a fixed price. When it was ready to lift from the soil, months later, a seller agreed to deliver it. Both congratulated themselves on their prudence. There was no thought of deceit, only of order, the same order that governed ships, spices and stocks. But with each transaction, the tulip crept further from the earth. Paper replaced soil, ink replaced seed, and the bloom itself became almost irrelevant. In a land built on water, even profits began to float. The meetings where these contracts changed hands were rarely solemn. They took place not in banks, but in taverns, warm, noisy rooms, thick with smoke and the scent of beer and ink. Long tables were cluttered with ledgers, glasses, and the occasional bulb displayed like a relic. Men gathered to talk of prices and prospects, voices rising over the clatter of mugs. The tulip became a conversational bridge between worlds, between scholars and sailors, bakers and brewers, lawyers and thieves. It was no longer a botanical curiosity, but a shared language of possibility. Here, among pipes and candlelight, the first murmurs of the modern futures market were spoken, though no one yet used the term. They preferred words like lots, shares and options. Each sounded more practical than the truth, that they were trading air. There was a kind of joy in it, at least at first. To trade tulips was to participate in something new, something almost democratic. The merchant and the craftsman sat side by side, each convinced that he, too, could read the rhythms of fortune. Contracts passed from hand to hand. Prices scribbled in margins, revised and passed again. The figures grew larger with each retelling. The tavern door opened and someone shouted the latest sale, a single bulb worth more than a sailor's year at sea. The room erupted in laughter, disbelief and applause. It was absurd, of course, but also intoxicating. For once, everyone was part of the same game. The flower itself became increasingly abstract. Few of the men signing contracts had ever seen a tulip in bloom. The prices rose and fell with each retelling. The worth of a bulb determined less by its colour than by how many believed in it. The language of trade replaced that of art. Words once used to describe beauty, flame, purity, grace, gave way to numbers and ratios. A tulip's lineage was spoken of the way one might describe a ship's tonnage or a company's yield. Even the drawings that once illustrated botanical catalogues were repurposed as tools of negotiation, held up in taverns to show what a man was buying. Reality had been replaced by representation. In this world of smoke and speculation, reputations bloomed as quickly as fortunes. A man known for his good taste could raise the value of a flower merely by admiring it. Others built entire livelihoods on rumour, whispering that a certain tulip would soon be scarce, or that a grower's field had been lost to frost. Such talk spread faster than any seed. The tulip had become not just a flower, but a story. One told in candlelight and repeated until it felt like truth. Holland's merchants, who once ruled by mathematics, now traded in belief. And yet, there was method in the madness. The Dutch had long been accustomed to risk. They insured ships that might never return, speculated on cargoes that might never arrive, and gambled daily against the sea itself. To them, this new trade was not folly, but familiarity. A tulip was simply another vessel for fortune, another venture to be managed with prudence and luck. The only difference was that this cargo existed entirely in promise. When winter made the soil too hard for planting, the market continued indoors, flourishing in words and wages. The tulip was now an idea untethered from the earth, a crop that needed neither sunlight nor rain, only faith. Notaries grew busier as contracts multiplied. They wrote in neat Latin, recording each transaction as if it were scripture. Prices were noted down to the guilder, delivery dates agreed upon, signatures affixed with pride. But beneath the careful handwriting, a quiet absurdity began to unfold. A single bulb might change hands 10 times before it ever bloomed. Ownership became a chain of expectation, each buyer hoping to sell before spring arrived. No one wanted the flower anymore, only the paper that promised it. The tulip, once a symbol of fragility, had become immortal in ink. As the trade deepened, the boundaries of respectability blurred. Bakers and carpenters began attending the same gatherings as merchants and lawyers, each with their own opinions on the market. A good tulip was discussed with the same gravity as a shipping route or an inheritance. The talk was no longer about cultivation, but opportunity. The very qualities that had once defined the Dutch, discipline, thrift, and calculation, now fed the illusion that they could master uncertainty itself. To buy a tulip was no longer to take a risk, it was to exercise reason. After all, everyone agreed that the price could only rise. By the winter months of early 1636, the trade had found its true home, not in gardens or counting houses, but in taverns. The air inside was thick with smoke and chatter, the glow of pipes and candles reflected in mugs of dark beer. Men crowded around long wooden tables, their coats damp from the mist outside, their laughter warm with drink and fortune. On the walls hung paintings of ships and saints, reminders that Holland owed its soul to both commerce and faith. Beneath them, the future of that faith was being rewritten in ink and wine. The tulip, once admired in silence, was now bartered with noise. Contracts passed across the tables, faster than tankards. Somewhere in the room, a man shouted the latest price of a Semper Augustus, and the noise swelled again like the tide. It was a new kind of market, one without goods, weights or measures. The bulbs themselves were miles away, sleeping in frozen earth, while their shadows danced across parchment. No one needed to see a flower to sell it. A name was enough, a signature sufficient. They called it the wind trade, and they laughed at the phrase even as they practiced it. Holland had built its empire on air, sails, windmills, and promises, and now the same invisible force filled its ledgers. The same hands that built ships to circumnavigate the world now argued over roots in the ground. Men who once commanded fleets now competed for bulbs that would never bloom before their eyes. The absurdity of it all only seemed to heighten the pleasure. There was camaraderie in speculation, a sense that everyone had joined the same play. Merchants sat beside bakers, sailors beside notaries, each one fluent in the language of profit. A stranger could walk in from the cold, order a drink, and find himself an investor before the mug was empty. The deals were quick, the stakes quicker. Coins clinked, quills scratched, and laughter rose above the hum of talk. The tavern had become a miniature exchange, a theatre where belief performed as certainty. A single contract might change hands 4 times before the night was over. The ink still wet, the terms forgotten. No one paused to think of soil or sunlight. The tulip existed now only in imagination, traded like faith at a fair. Even the walls seemed to listen. The sound of speculation had a rhythm, a pulse that filled the room like music. Men leaned in close, smoke curling between them, their faces half lit by the candle's trembling glow. One spoke of a new variety rumoured to have emerged in Haarlem, a tulip striped like marble and priced like a fortune. Another swore that the market in Alkmaar was doubling by the day, and that anyone who hesitated was a fool. Their voices wove together in patterns as intricate as the flowers they chased, a tapestry of greed and hope stitched with rumour. The tavern keeper, who had no bulbs of his own, made a fortune in beer and patience. Outside, the canals were frozen, and the city lay quiet under snow. Inside, the heat and noise pressed close, the windows fogged with breath. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and wet wool. A man could barely hear his own thoughts over the din of optimism. At one table, a carpenter boasted that he had sold a bulb he did not yet own. At another, a sailor claimed he could retire on a contract for one he had never seen. Each story invited a new one, more miraculous than the last. The line between truth and jest blurred until no one could tell them apart. Every man's gain was another's promise. Every promise was treated as fact. The taverns became maps of a nation intoxicated by itself. Haarlem had its circles, Amsterdam its regulars, Leiden its whispering corners, where the learned and the reckless traded side by side. Even the smallest towns had their gatherings. A handful of men in a back room, passing slips of paper between pints of ale. The republic that had once prized thrift now prided itself on daring. No voyage to the Indies, no expedition across the Atlantic could match the speed or simplicity of this new commerce. There were no storms, no pirates, no seas to cross, only ink and belief. It was trade without hardship, wealth without weight. Yet beneath the laughter, something faintly uneasy stirred. The jokes grew louder, as though to drown it out. The tavern's light, so golden at first, began to flicker. A few men spoke quietly of how high prices had climbed, of friends who had begun to borrow against their homes, of apprentices spending wages they had not yet earned. But their caution only fed the appetite of the crowd. For every man who hesitated, 3 more stepped forward, eager to take his place. Reason was slow, profit was quick, and in the glow of drink and company, profit always seemed the better companion. In a corner, a notary leaned over a ledger, his spectacles glinting in the candlelight. He was there to witness, to give the illusion of order to the chaos. He wrote the names carefully, recorded the amounts, stamped each contract with his seal. Around him, the trade continued, loud and unending. The tavern smelled of ink now, as much as ale. It was said that more wealth changed hands in those smoky rooms than in the city's banks. For a brief glittering moment, every man who could write his name felt himself a merchant prince. The tulip itself had vanished entirely from the conversation. It no longer bloomed in soil, but in speculation. Its worth was spoken of in ratios, in predictions, in the musical clatter of numbers that rose higher with every round of drinks. It was the perfect commodity, small, silent, and endlessly divisible. The flower had been refined into pure potential. Its beauty was now a story told between sips. Its existence a matter of faith. The more distant the bloom became, the more certain everyone was that it would never fade. And yet, amid all the noise, there was something strangely theatrical about it, as though everyone knew, in some small corner of their mind, that they were performing. The jokes, the boasts, the wagers, they were roles played with conviction. A man who had lost a fortune one night might return the next with twice the confidence, insisting that tomorrow would bring a turn of luck. Each handshake sealed a friendship as much as a contract. The tavern had become a stage, and the actors were indistinguishable from their audience. The market was not a place anymore, but a performance, a shared illusion held together by good humour and exhaustion. When the candles burned low, wax pooling like spilled gold across the tables, the noise softened to a hum. Men counted coins by touch, their faces half hidden in smoke. Laughter rose again, quiet but sincere, echoing off the beams. It was a sound of triumph, of fellowship, and of something else, the relief of still believing. Hands clasped across the tables, tankards were lifted, contracts folded and tucked into pockets. The tulip for this moment was not a flower or a fortune, but a bond between men who had convinced themselves that faith was a kind of wealth. By the time spring of 1636 came around, the tulip had transcended its humble origins. What had once been the obsession of collectors and the amusement of merchants had now become a statement of identity. In the drawing rooms of Amsterdam and Haarlem, the flower bloomed again, not in soil but in self-regard. Silk curtains framed vases of tulips there, arranged like trophies, their colours glowing in candlelight beside silver ewers and polished mirrors. Guests admired them with the same seriousness they reserved for art or ancestry. A tulip was no longer a flower, but a declaration, proof that one belonged to the world of discernment, fortune, and fashion. The Republic, so recently freed from Spanish rule, had discovered a new aristocracy, one born not of blood, but of bulbs. In these rooms conversation turned reverent. Merchants who had once measured success by cargo tonnage now spoke of petals with the vocabulary of saints. Each bloom had its lineage, its myth. The great varieties were named like nobility: Admiral van Enkhuizen, General Bol, Semper Augustus, Admiral of Admirals. The names themselves were performances, a hierarchy of vanity disguised as horticulture. Guests would murmur their admiration in tones usually reserved for nobility or God. A single bulb, someone might remark, could buy a canal house, a sign perhaps that God preferred gardeners. The paintings of the time preserved this strange new faith. In still lifes crowded with fruit, pewter and pearls, the tulip rose above the composition, like an emblem of refined excess. Artists rendered its streaked petals with devotional precision, their trembling lines suggesting both fragility and pride. In these images, the Dutch obsession with order found its paradox, beauty that flourished because it refused control. The tulip was the nation in miniature, cultivated, profitable, and destined to fade. To paint it was to confess admiration for both creation and decay. The more perfectly it was captured, the closer it seemed to death. Merchants began to commission portraits of themselves holding tulips, a gesture that would have seemed absurd a generation earlier. The bulb became shorthand for sophistication, the flower a stand-in for ambition. A man's standing could be read in the names he owned. Those who could afford Semper Augustus, white petals streaked like veins of blood, flaunted it as proof of their superiority. It was whispered that fewer than a dozen true bulbs existed, each one worth more than a craftsman's lifetime of labour. The owners were envied, mocked and admired in equal measure. Their gardens became pilgrimage sites for the aspiring and the curious, the flower beds guarded as jealously as vaults. Behind the iron gates of those gardens, tulips were tended like relics. Servants watered them by schedule, brushed away frost, and counted the bulbs as carefully as coins. Visitors were guided through paths of sand and clipped yew to admire the rarest blooms, their hosts gesturing with the pride of conquerors. The tulip was a miracle made tangible, an empire contained in a pot. To possess one was to master time itself, to claim the fleeting and make it permanent. The flower's power lay not in its scent or shape, but in its exclusivity. Even its silence felt aristocratic. The cult had its own language of morality. Collectors spoke of taste, virtue, and refinement, as if these were measurable qualities like colour or yield. A man who spent a fortune on tulips was not reckless but enlightened, participating in a higher order of appreciation. The flower was said to refine the mind, to purify the spirit, to elevate commerce into art. Yet beneath the sermons of elegance, vanity bloomed. Husbands justified their collections as investments. Wives displayed the flowers as jewellery that could not tarnish. Children were given bulbs in place of inheritances. Even ministers, discreetly, of course, kept a pot or two in their studies, the blooms nodding gently beside their Bibles. Outside the drawing rooms, the admiration became contagious. Shopkeepers began to hang small paintings of tulips in their windows, hoping to borrow some of their glamour. Artisans carved their likeness into furniture, while potters painted them on earthenware. The flower had become a national emblem, as Dutch as herring, as pious as thrift, and as lucrative as trade. Sermons warned against vanity, but the warnings rang hollow. When a flower could buy a house, who could resist temptation? The social divide that once separated the collectors from the commoners began to blur. The stories spread faster than the bulbs themselves. A neighbour's cousin had sold a single tulip for enough to retire. A widow in Haarlem was said to have bought one bulb and sold it for 10 times the price within a week. The mathematics of fortune sounded simple enough. The right flower, the right buyer, and a single stroke of luck. Ordinary citizens began to dream of gardens they could not afford and profits they could not imagine. They gathered in taverns not to trade contracts but to listen, to speculate aloud, to imagine what it might feel like to be among the chosen. In the homes of the wealthy, the servants noticed the change. They whispered about their master's obsessions as they trimmed the wicks and cleared the plates. They spoke of bulbs guarded like treasure, of arguments over misplaced catalogues, of visitors who arrived after midnight to see a flower by lamplight. Some claimed their masters had stopped sleeping altogether, pacing the halls while waiting for a bloom to open. A few, it was said, had gone so far as to take out loans against bulbs still buried in the ground. The whispers crept outward, through kitchens, down alleys, across markets, until even those who had never seen a tulip began to feel its pull. In every story, the numbers grew larger. A farmer claimed to have sold a single bulb for a cart of wheat, then 2 carts, then a farm itself. No one questioned it. Disbelief had become impolite. The flower's fame fed on repetition, each telling gilded with a little more wonder. By the time the tale reached the next town, the tulip had already doubled in value. The mania was still genteel, still contained within the language of elegance and investment, but the fever had begun. A quiet contagion moved through the Republic, whispering that beauty was not only admirable, it was profitable. The flower had become a mirror in which everyone saw themselves a little grander, a little luckier, a little closer to fortune. Its symmetry reassured them. Its rarity promised them distinction. Its price made them dream. Even those who scorned the trade could not help but measure their lives against it. The tulip had ceased to be an object. It had become an idea, the perfect Dutch marriage of refinement and gain. It promised grace without labour, wealth without risk, and in that promise lay its danger. The bulb, resting silent beneath the earth, had already become something greater than itself, a vessel for every unspoken longing of the age. The Republic that had once worshipped reason now found its faith transplanted into soil, and as the wealthy continued to display their living jewels before audiences eager to be dazzled, the illusion spread beyond their walls. Servants spoke, artisans listened, farmers dreamed. The contagion had begun. By the height of 1636, the noise of belief had become impossible to ignore. What had once been confined to drawing rooms and taverns now spilled into the markets, the guild halls, the docks. Every street seemed to hum with the same improbable conviction that the tulip was a gift not only of nature, but of providence, that whoever possessed it would share in its bloom. The trade, once the pastime of scholars and merchants, had grown into something far larger and far louder. It no longer belonged to the refined or the wealthy. It belonged to anyone with a coin, a rumour, or a dream. The market swelled each morning with a crowd that seemed to multiply by the hour. Bakers arrived before dawn, their hands still dusted with flour, to check the day's prices. Weavers brought bolts of unfinished cloth as collateral. Sailors fresh off the ships came to wager their wages before even returning home. There were barbers and cobblers, widows clutching coins wrapped in handkerchiefs, farmers who had never seen a tulip and never would. They came not to admire flowers but to harvest faith. The talk of fortunes was too constant, too vivid to resist. Someone's neighbour had bought a bulb for 10 guilders and sold it for 100. Someone's cousin had traded a field and gained a warehouse. In a country where discipline had long been the highest virtue, greed disguised itself easily as diligence. The fever moved faster than any ship or sermon. Prices doubled between sunrise and sunset. Contracts were signed over beer and ink, torn up and signed again before the next drink was poured. Houses were pawned, jewellery sold, apprenticeships abandoned. People who had never held a quill before now signed their names with trembling pride. Notaries worked without rest, stamping documents for bulbs that had never been planted, might never exist. The Republic, a place of measured precision, found itself overtaken by velocity. The trade no longer obeyed reason, it obeyed rhythm. In Harlem, the market square filled daily with speculation, disguised as celebration. Men crowded together beneath awnings, shouting prices, waving papers, shaking hands. Women bargained with the same certainty as merchants, some trading tulip futures for dowries yet to be earned. Children ran errands carrying folded contracts between taverns. The city sounded like a forge, its heat not from fire, but from friction. Paper against paper, promise against promise. And still the prices climbed. A single Semper Augustus was said to be worth a townhouse on the Herengracht. A man could exchange a bulb for a carriage, or for the land on which one might build an entire street. The tulip had become both mirror and mirage. It reflected ambition and rewarded belief. There was an almost holy language to the trade. The tulip was no longer described as a flower, but as an opportunity, a chance, a ticket. Even the poor began to speak of a "my bulb," meaning not one they owned, but one they expected to. Hope had become a form of ownership. Bakers spoke of retiring. Sailors planned to buy their own ships. Every conversation circled back to the same question, whispered half in jest but with a tremor of sincerity. How high can it go? The only answer anyone seemed to agree on was higher. The frenzy gave birth to strange economies of its own. Pawnbrokers began accepting bulbs as collateral, though most never saw them. Inns offered tulip accounts, allowing guests to speculate between meals. In some towns, churches were rumoured to have invested parish funds. Quietly, of course, as though heaven itself might sanction the market. And everywhere, the language of certainty grew louder. "It cannot fall," said the merchants. "It will never end," said the craftsmen. "It is ordained," said the hopeful. The Republic, once the model of restraint, now floated on a tide of collective euphoria. At night, the cities glowed with candlelight as the trade continued in homes and taverns. The air outside was cold, but the rooms inside were bright and close, thick with laughter and the smell of wax. Every conversation was a rehearsal for success. What one would do with the profit, where one would move, whom one would repay. Even the cautious found themselves drawn in, if only not to be left behind. Those who hesitated were pitied as unimaginative. To doubt the tulip was to doubt progress itself, and progress in this new age was sacred. For the first time, the Republic felt united by a single purpose. The sea no longer divided classes. The church no longer divided hearts. Everyone, from the grand merchant to the humble cooper, was bound by the same fragile dream. The tulip had become a national project, a promise that beauty and profit could coexist, that the Dutch talent for precision had at last discovered perfection. Men spoke of the flower as if it were destiny made visible. A single bulb could lift a man's fortune, secure his children's future, and erase the long memory of labour. It was a dream too perfect to resist, and yet even dreams have a cost. The tulip fields lay mostly untended. The bulbs, forgotten beneath frost, became almost symbolic. The true harvest was paper, a crop that required no soil, no weather, only confidence. People traded futures upon futures, debts upon debts, until the numbers lost all proportion. Some boasted of profits they had not made, others spent fortunes they had not earned. Still, the illusion held. It was spring in every contract, perpetual and fragrant. The Republic had discovered how to make time itself bloom, again and again. There was a strangeness in the streets that season, a kind of delirious politeness, as though everyone were keeping the same improbable secret. When strangers passed each other, they smiled knowingly, each convinced the other was part of the same miracle. Artists painted tulips into the corners of their canvases, even when no one had asked them to. Poets wrote verses about beauty and commerce, about flowers that never faded, and fortunes that never died. The market had become myth, and the myth, in turn, had become reality. The air smelled faintly of smoke, damp earth, and something sweeter, the perfume of collective belief. Even the government, usually sober and sceptical, seemed hesitant to interfere. A few officials muttered about speculation, but their warnings were swallowed by laughter. After all, the tulip trade was not a crime, it was commerce, that most Dutch of virtues. And besides, many of those who governed had invested too. No one wanted the spell to break. To question the market was to risk sounding unpatriotic, even ungrateful. For the first time in memory, Holland seemed immune to misfortune. Prosperity had become a kind of weather, constant, benevolent, and self-sustaining. The days grew longer, the light more golden, the confidence more blinding. Coins changed hands faster than petals fell. The Republic, which once counted every nail and measured every beam, now measured its worth in fantasies. The tulip had ceased to be a flower. It had become a belief system, a currency of conviction. The hum of trade, once industrious, now sounded fevered, like the wings of something flying too close to the sun. By midsummer, even the most sceptical had surrendered to the noise. To be cautious was to be poor. To be prudent was to be invisible. People who once mocked the trade began to join it. They said it was safer to be a fool with everyone else than to be wise alone. The air shimmered with optimism, as if the whole country had agreed to live inside a shared hallucination. The flower that had once been admired for its restraint now embodied its opposite: excess, vanity, delirium. As the bells of Haarlem rang one bright morning, announcing another round of trades and another round of laughter, the markets seemed to hum like beehives. The air itself felt swollen with confidence. The Dutch Republic had never been richer, nor more certain of its own invincibility. The world, they believed, had finally learned how to bloom without end. The country that measured every inch of its canals now measured hope. And somewhere faint but undeniable, a tremor began. It began, as most endings do, with something small. A single trader in Haarlem, no one of particular note, refused to honour a contract. Perhaps he meant it as a joke, or perhaps he had simply lost his nerve. He had agreed to buy a bulb in January, but by February the price had climbed so high that even wealth began to look fragile beside it. When the seller came to collect, the buyer smiled, shrugged, and said he had changed his mind. The story spread through the taverns faster than any ship's cargo ever had. One man refusing to pay, it seemed laughable, even harmless. Yet behind the laughter, a question took root that no one wanted to speak aloud. What if others did the same? For months, faith had been a kind of currency, traded as easily as coin. Now, for the first time, it began to lose its shine. the certainty that had filled the taverns and markets, the proud rhythm of speculation, slowed almost imperceptibly. A few buyers delayed their payments. A few sellers hesitated to deliver. Each blamed the weather or illness or a misunderstanding. But beneath the polite excuses, something colder stirred. Confidence, that invisible foundation of the trade, was beginning to crack. And like all invisible things, no one noticed until it was too late. In the taverns, the mood shifted by degrees. The laughter still came, but it rang too loud, too quickly, as if to drown out the sound of doubt. Men who had once greeted each other with easy cheer now studied their ledgers. With frowns they tried to disguise. The conversations that had once sparkled with gossip and triumph began to stumble. Someone mentioned a sale that had fallen through, and for a moment the table went quiet before the jokes resumed. Another man claimed that his buyer had vanished altogether, and the others laughed, but no one asked for names. It was easier to pretend that the story was just another exaggeration, one of many that had made the tulip trade so entertaining. Rumour became the new currency, circulating faster than any bulb or contract. It was said that certain towns had stopped honouring their deals, that notaries were refusing to stamp new contracts, that buyers were vanishing like mist. No one knew what was true, and no one wanted to. The same men who had built the market on imagination now discovered that imagination could just as easily undo it. A whispered doubt could undo a fortune. A pause could halt an entire city. Still, the Republic tried to carry on. Markets opened each morning, as they always had, though the crowds were thinner now. A few traders lingered longer than usual over their drinks, waiting to see if anyone else would make the first move. The once brisk exchanges slowed to conversations. Papers were handled more carefully, contracts read twice instead of once. It was no longer enough to believe. One needed proof, and proof was suddenly hard to find. A single unpaid bill seemed to echo through every transaction, each echo growing louder as it travelled. In Harlem, the notaries were the first to sense the change. Their offices, once crowded with impatient traders, grew strangely quiet. Clerks sat idle, their quills dry, as men paced the hall outside, arguing in low voices. No one wanted to be the first to admit what everyone already knew, that the market depended not on gold or goods, but on trust, and trust had begun to evaporate. The very paper that once symbolised security now seemed to tremble in their hands. The taverns, too, began to lose their warmth. The smoke hung heavier, the air colder, the laughter thinner. Men drank more but spoke less. A new sound crept into the rooms, the rustle of paper being torn. Some traders tried to reassure each other that it was only a correction, that the prices would rise again when spring came. Others nodded but did not answer. Even the word spring had lost its promise. The bulbs still slept in the earth, but no one seemed sure they would ever wake. In Amsterdam, a merchant who had once sold contracts for thousands of guilders found that no one would offer him half that sum. He laughed it off, calling it a temporary lull, but when he returned the next day, the price had fallen again. By the end of the week, no one was buying at all. In Harlem, a weaver who had traded his loom for a tulip learned that his buyer had disappeared. He told himself it was an error, that the man would return tomorrow. He said it again the next day, and the next, until the words no longer sounded like hope, but habit. The illusion faltered not with an explosion, but with a pause. It was the silence between offers, the momentary stillness when no one knew what to say. For years, the Republic had been united in noise, the hum of confidence, the music of exchange. Now that sound had gone flat. The markets that had once seemed alive with possibility felt hollow. Men stared at their papers as if expecting them to speak, to reassure them that the dream still had substance, but paper has no voice, and belief once broken makes no sound. In the churches, ministers preached sermons about humility, and people listened with sudden attention. The same congregations that had once smiled politely at such warnings now sat in uneasy silence. Perhaps it was coincidence, they told themselves. Perhaps the trade had simply run its course, as all good things must. Yet beneath the public composure ran a private panic. Creditors pressed for payment, debtors vanished. The same streets that had once glowed with promise now seemed narrower, colder, more ordinary. The Republic's faith in reason had finally collided with its faith in profit, and neither seemed certain to survive. There were still those who insisted that the market would recover. They pointed to past slumps, to the resilience of trade, to the promise of the next season's bloom. But even they spoke with a caution that betrayed their doubt. No one wanted to be the first to call it over, just as no one wanted to be the last to believe. The laughter, when it came, had a brittle edge, as if the sound itself was straining under its own weight. By the final weeks of February 1637, the light itself seemed thinner. It fell through frosted windows and across the merchant streets with a pale, reluctant glow, touching shutters that no one bothered to open. The air felt emptied, the way it does after a storm that never quite breaks. Holland had gone silent, and in that silence lay the sound of reckoning. The laughter that had once filled the taverns, the arguments over bulbs and contracts, had vanished. In their place remained only the faint creak of signs swaying in the wind and the muffled scrape of boots across frozen stone. The tulip trade, that proud, delirious theatre of faith and fortune, had come to an end almost overnight. It began quietly with a public auction in Haarlem. Tulips were brought to the floor, their names read aloud in the same confident tones that had once guaranteed profit. But this time, no hands were raised. The crowd murmured uneasy, waiting for someone to make the first bid. None came. The auctioneer cleared his throat, lowered the price, tried again. Still nothing. The air in the hall grew heavier with each passing moment, and when the gavel finally struck wood, it sounded not like an ending, but like a confession. By morning the news had spread. No one was buying. Across the Republic, panic disguised itself as politeness. Merchants sent letters insisting that payments were merely delayed. Debtors promised restitution that would never arrive. Notaries, once overwhelmed by contracts, now sat idle, staring at the piles of paper that had lost all meaning. What had been written in ink now read like fiction. Fortunes dissolved faster than snow in rain. A single decision, not to buy, not to pay, had broken the spell. And because the tulip's value had lived entirely in imagination, there was nothing left to catch it as it fell. The courts were flooded with pleas for mediation. Growers demanded payment for bulbs they had cultivated all year. Buyers protested that they could not be forced to purchase something whose price no longer existed. Judges deliberated, but the law had no precedent for such things. A flower was not land or livestock. It could not be weighed or taxed. How does one measure the worth of a promise? Each verdict seemed to contradict the last, and every ruling only deepened the confusion. The government's decrees meant to calm the markets, instead confirmed what everyone already feared, that there was nothing left to regulate. The tulip, so long treated as a financial instrument, was once again only a flower. In Amsterdam, merchants tore open their ledgers and stared at the numbers that no longer connected to reality. Men who had been wealthy enough to fund voyages across oceans now found themselves penniless. Warehouses were sold, homes mortgaged, dowries rescinded. Ships prepared for spring voyages left port half empty. There was no capital left to fill them. The same hands that had built an empire from wind and trade now trembled over scraps of paper, as if the ink itself might still contain value. Tulip gardens, once guarded and admired, fell into neglect. The beds lay frozen, the bulbs buried beneath layers of ice and indifference. No one came to visit. No one cared which varieties would bloom. the rarest cultivars, Semper Augustus, Viceroy, Admiral van der Eyck, no longer signified glory, only embarrassment. Their owners avoided mentioning them altogether. In Haarlem, gardeners began uprooting their bulbs, not to sell, but to reclaim their soil. The earth, indifferent to human vanity, accepted them without judgment. Spring arrived late that year, hesitant and grey. When the tulips finally bloomed, their petals opened to empty air. There were no admirers at the fences, no auctions in the squares, no sketches commissioned to immortalise their colour. The flowers stood in perfect silence, untouched, their beauty now indistinguishable from shame. Even spring, it seemed, had arrived like an apology. The markets that had once overflowed with voices were deserted. Taverns, their tables scarred by years of ink and ale, stood half-lit and echoing. The air that had once hummed with certainty now carried the dull scent of wax and stale beer. A few old contracts remained scattered across the floors, trampled and forgotten, their promises no longer worth the parchment they were written on. The notaries had stopped recording anything at all. There was nothing left to record. Some tried to keep trading, insisting that recovery was inevitable, but every sale required a buyer, and buyers were the one thing the Republic no longer had. The very optimism that had driven the boom now ensured its collapse. Everyone had been too certain, too exposed, too proud. The illusion had held only because it had been shared, and now that it had cracked, there was no way to mend it. The same collective belief that had inflated the bubble now imploded with equal force, leaving only silence in its wake. For a time, people continued to speak of the market in whispers, as though it were a recent death. In taverns, men avoided meeting one another's eyes, ashamed of their own gullibility. Some cursed the government for not intervening sooner. Others cursed themselves for not selling earlier. A few claimed to have known all along that the prices were madness, though their names appeared in the same ledgers as everyone else's. The Republic, which had once prided itself on reason, now looked back on its brief delirium with disbelief. How could so many have been so certain, for so long, about something that had never truly existed? In the following weeks, creditors came knocking. Households that had glowed with the confidence of new wealth now dimmed under the weight of debt. Servants were dismissed, apprentices sent home, dowries withdrawn. The social order that had briefly blurred during the mania snapped back into place, but with a bitterness that refused to fade. The poor remained poor, and the rich were once again rich, or at least those who had not risked everything. The dream of equality through speculation had evaporated, leaving only the old hierarchies, more visible than ever. The tulip itself, that innocent accomplice, survived its own disaster. It continued to bloom, season after season, indifferent to the paper empires built in its name. Painters still painted it, though now with irony rather than awe. A few collectors kept their gardens, tending them in silence, as though by caring for the flower they might atone for their folly, but most simply turned away, unwilling to be reminded of what they had lost, not merely money, but dignity. In Haarlem, the tavern that had once hosted the most famous traders closed its doors. Inside, the tables still bore the stains of spilled ale and candle wax, hardened into pale, twisted pools. Papers lay scattered across the floor. Contracts, inventories, letters of credit, all flattened and useless. Their ink faded to grey. The last man to leave blew out the candles one by one until the room was swallowed by darkness. Outside, the wind moved through the empty streets, lifting scraps of paper into the air like withered petals. The city slept uneasily, unsure whether the silence it heard was peace or ruin. The Republic that had once measured its worth in flowers had discovered, too late, that belief leaves no trace when it dies. And so the night held still, not with hope, not with grief, but with the hollow calm that follows disbelief. When the noise finally faded, Holland woke to an unfamiliar sound. Quiet. The markets no longer roared, the taverns no longer sang, and the endless clatter of coins and contracts had vanished into memory. What remained was the dull rhythm of ordinary life returning, slow, reluctant, and faintly embarrassed. Bakers rose before dawn once more, feeding the same ovens they had once promised to abandon. Sailors returned to their ships, their hands cracked from the cold, but steady again with honest labour. Clerks reopened their ledgers, copying numbers that felt small now, almost comforting in their modesty. The Republic had survived its fever, but it woke from it changed, as though the very air had thickened with disbelief. There were no proclamations, no official reckonings. The government made a few quiet rulings, and pamphleteers wrote moral essays about greed, but no one truly wanted to speak of what had happened. The nation preferred to look forward, not inward. Yet the silence said enough. The men who had once shouted prices across taverns now walked past each other in the streets without a word. A nod, a glance, and then eyes lowered to the cobblestones. Friendships that had been sealed over tankards and signatures dissolved in shame. No one wanted to be recognised as one of the dreamers. The Republic, so proud of its reason, had been reminded that reason itself can be a kind of faith, and faith once broken is slow to heal. Debtors disappeared quietly. A few fled to smaller towns, others stayed pretending nothing had changed, their pride stronger than their poverty. Creditors became reluctant to collect, as if politeness might disguise the losses. Everyone had known someone who had been ruined, and nearly everyone had lost something, if not money, then dignity. The mania had burned through every rank of society, leaving behind no villains, only participants. It had not been crime or conquest that humbled the Dutch, but belief itself. In the homes of merchants, tulip paintings still hung on the walls, though now their colours seemed sharper, almost mocking. Artists continued to paint them, but not as trophies. The flowers had become symbols of vanity and folly, reminders of the brief season when beauty had been mistaken for wealth. In these still lifes, the tulip often stood beside a skull, an hourglass, or a guttering candle, the vanitous motifs that spoke of mortality and time. The irony was almost tender. The flower still bloomed, still flawless, even as everything built around it had withered. The tulip endured, only faith had wilted. Outside, the world moved on with a kind of weary grace. Ships still departed from Amsterdam's harbours, carrying spices, silks, and all the tangible wealth the flower had once promised to replace. The merchants who had survived turned their attention back to trade, muttering about lessons learned, but secretly watching the next market for signs of opportunity. Holland's genius was resilience. The same discipline that had made the mania possible now made recovery inevitable. The canals were dredged, the books were balanced, and life resumed its measured pace. But beneath that calm surface, something had shifted, a quiet recognition that even a nation built on reason was not immune to dreams. In Haarlem, the tulip fields bloomed again that spring, as they always did. Their colours were as brilliant as ever, but fewer people came to see them. The flowers belonged once more to the gardeners, the botanists, and the bees. They grew and faded without witnesses. Their beauty returned to its natural insignificance. A few bulbs still changed hands, but only for modest sums. The same flower that had once been worth a house could now be bought for a loaf of bread. Those who had lost fortunes pretended to find comfort in that, as though the flower's indifference somehow absolved them. Taverns, once the heart of speculation, became places of avoidance. Men who had once filled them with laughter now sat in corners, nursing quiet drinks, their hands still stained faintly with ink. The contracts had vanished, but the memory of them lingered. Every creak of a chair, every candle flame reflected on the table seemed to echo the frenzy that had lived there only months before. The wax that had once dripped onto the wood had hardened into strange pale scars, as though the taverns themselves had aged. Artists painted new kinds of pictures, no longer tulips in vases, but taverns after closing, ledgers left open on empty desks, winter light falling through unwashed windows. The mania had given them something beautiful to mourn, and mourning, as always, was good for art. The Republic, unwilling to speak of its shame, expressed it instead through silence, a silence rendered in oil and canvas, reflection and restraint. In the cities, rumours of suicides drifted quietly between doorways. A ruined merchant, a bankrupt notary, a sailor who had bet his savings on a promise that never bloomed. The stories were told softly, without judgment. The Republic had no appetite for punishment. It was too busy trying to forget. Yet forgetting proved difficult. The mania had been brief, but it had left behind a subtle unease, a question that could not be answered. How had a people so rational convinced themselves that a flower could defy gravity? Spring passed into summer, and the tulips faded. Their petals fell across garden paths uncollected. Children played among them, scattering what their parents had once worshipped. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and salt from the sea. Holland's wealth still glittered in its harbours, but it seemed dimmer somehow, less certain. The world had not ended, it never does, but something in the nation's reflection had changed. The mirror that had once shown perfection now showed distortion, faint but lasting. By autumn, the talk of tulips had vanished from the markets. A new cargo from the Indies arrived, a new trade route opened, a new season began. The country, practical as ever, absorbed its lesson and carried on. But sometimes at dusk, when the canals grew still and the last lights stretched across their surfaces, people could see the reflection of their city, perfect, serene, and faintly unreal, and think of those days when they had tried to trade beauty itself. In Haarlem, a few of the old traders gathered sometimes at dusk, drawn together by habit more than hope. They sat in the same taverns where their fortunes had bloomed and died, speaking quietly of weather, crops, and ships. Every so often one would mention the word tulip, and the others would smile faintly, a little embarrassed, as if recalling a youth spent foolishly but fondly. There was no bitterness now, only a kind of exhausted affection, the way one remembers a dream that had once felt real. By the time the year ended, the Republic had regained its composure. The canals were clean, the market steady, the ledgers balanced. The tulip had returned to being what it had always been, a flower, admired and then forgotten. Yet something in the air remained altered, a softness, a humility, as though the wind itself had learned to move more carefully over the water. The gardens bloomed again the following spring, as they always had, but the crowds did not return. The flowers were left to themselves, and perhaps, for the first time, that was enough. The city rested in a reflective stillness. The canals, once thought to mirror gold, now mirrored only sky, calm, blue and weightless. In that still water lay the faint shimmer of memory, quiet and incorruptible. Holland had measured the price of wonder and found it unsustainable. The flowers had outlived the fantasy, and the Republic had outlived its embarrassment. What remained was something quieter, wiser, and perhaps more beautiful for having broken. The mania had ended, as all dreams do, not with revelation, but with awakening. Holland returned to its rhythms. Ships sailed, ovens burned, ledgers balanced, yet something invisible lingered. For a nation that had once measured the world in numbers, it was humbling to discover how easily numbers could dissolve. The tulip had revealed nothing new about greed or folly. It had only shown, with quiet precision, how much of human certainty depends on belief. For a few seasons, the flower had promised eternity. It was perfect, rare, symmetrical, a geometry of beauty that seemed to defy decay. People looked at it and imagined permanence. They traded it as though wonder could be stored. But the tulip never lied. It only bloomed briefly, while others mistook beauty for proof. When the illusion faded, the flower remained exactly what it had always been: fragile, vivid, and fleeting. Each century finds its own version of the same dream. The names change: railway stocks, South Sea ventures, housing, crypto, but the rhythm endures. Desire dresses itself as reason. Optimism becomes mathematics, and every time the world convinces itself that this flower, at last, will not fade. The lesson is never forgotten, only postponed. The Dutch were not fools. They were merely human, restless, brilliant, and unwilling to accept that perfection cannot be possessed. In the end, the tulip story was not about failure, but about longing, the wish to hold beauty still, to make time bloom. It was never the flower that betrayed them. It was hope that asked too much. Now, centuries later, the tulip still opens each spring, untouched by history. It leans toward the morning light, unaware of the fortunes once buried in its name. Its petals flare, then fall, silent as paper. Around it, the world continues its calculations: ships, stocks, screens and promises, all petals of the same perennial plant. The tulip does not remember. It only endures. And still, somewhere, someone believes the next flower will last forever. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.